Welcome back to Close Up. 2026 features a race for an open seat in the 1st Congressional District. One of the Republican contenders joins us this morning, Brian Cole, who's currently a state representative serving Manchester up at the State House in Concord. Representative Cole, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So we're in 2026 now. The much debated Affordable Care Act subsidies are gone. We'll see if Congress and the Senate are able to bring them back in some form or not, but that's TBD. By some estimates, we're looking at around 20 million people on the exchanges facing an increase in health care costs or insurance costs of about 114%, so it's considerable. What do you think should happen next with health care?
I think the Republicans are on the right track and looking at the whole picture. We need a solution for the whole problem, not just a small sliver of people. And what they passed this summer, I think, goes a long way. You're going to see health premiums reduced for Granite Staters by 11% in this coming year. And yeah, I think that's the right way to go. Look at a whole real solution, not a Band-Aid solution like Chris Pappas tried to pass.
Yeah, any specifics, though, about what can be done to make things more affordable for more people? Say, for instance, those who are, they don't make enough to go on Medicaid, or a little enough to go on Medicaid, but they're stuck between being unable to afford the insurance.
Yeah, like I said, that legislation that they passed this summer should reduce premiums by 11% for Granite Staters, so that's going to go a long way to helping everybody out. You have to look at a long-term solution, not just a Band-Aid solution, right? That's like the Affordable Care Act.
Right. As a Republican, government's not the answer, but you were a business owner. Do you ever find yourself thinking, why am I the guy responsible for all this health insurance? Is employer-based health insurance the answer long-term, especially as we see more entrepreneurship and the sort of internet opens up more of that gig economy, if you will?
I think it's a combination of both. I mean, it's just, for me, it was just a line item and an expense that I had in the business, so I accepted it as part of doing business.
You know, one of the biggest stories from the last week and a half was this report from the Washington Post that a immigrant detainee facility may be located in Merrimack. This is a draft plan coming out of ICE, reported by the Washington Post, as I noted. So one source, and nobody's confirmed this yet, so no plans are in effect at the moment. This isn't official. But do you support the concept of bringing a detainee facility like that to the 1st District?
I think we need to take care of the illegal immigrants coming into the state of New Hampshire, and I certainly was one of the people that I voted against having sanctuary cities in the state of New Hampshire while I was up at the State House.
Even potential negative impacts, though. I mean, you look at a place like that, even some of the Republicans in Merrimack are now saying, gosh, is this really the place for this? When you think about 500 to 1,000 people, I think that's bigger than the capacity of the Valley Street Jail in Manchester.
Oh, geez. I didn't realize it was that many people, but hopefully that whatever they do, they'll make appropriate accommodations to make it habitable for those people that are being detained.
But the impact of the taxpayer locally, right? You're talking about services. How many times are the police or first responders going to get called? You know, who knows what, the impact to water, sewer, surrounding properties. Are there any concerns on that front?
No, I think that's already happening now, so we'll just deal with it like we have been.
This year, the U.S. Supreme Court is expected to make a decision on the Trump administration's challenge to birthright citizenship. That's the idea that anyone who is born here is automatically a U.S. citizen. Are you in favor of a change to that status of birthright citizenship?
No, I think the way it's been has been fine. I mean, it's been that way for an awful long time, certainly my whole life. If you were born here in the United States, you're a naturally born citizen.
And yet there are a lot of people who are saying, people who come here, if they're illegal, their kids should not be legal. Do you see an issue with that?
It seems like a kind of a fine line there. But no, I don't see an issue with that. I think if they come here and they're born in the United States, they should be a naturally born citizen. That's just the way the Constitution was written.
All right. Holiday season has also seen an escalation in tensions with the country of Venezuela and the United States. There have been military strikes on boats, and now we're seeing it on the shoreline. The president has indicated this is about oil. Some of this is about drugs, obviously, with these boats. For a lot of people, though, are calling this a quote-unquote regime change war. They want to see Maduro out. Do you support a so-called regime change war in Venezuela?
Well, I think what he's doing is good. We want to stop the drugs coming into the United States. I was on part of the bail reform here that saved 500 lives here in New Hampshire the year that we passed that bail reform. It's a very important issue to me. And now that he's stopping the oil and stopping that income, all of a sudden the president of Venezuela wants to talk to the president of the United States and have a sit-down. So I think it's working.
The fentanyl, though, is coming through ports of entry, United States-Mexico border. I mean, I guess if we're going to use the military to stop these things, what's hurting New Hampshire is not stuff coming on boats from Venezuela, right?
No, that was part of it's one of my platform issues, securing our northern border. What they're doing is they're bringing marijuana across the state of We have 58 miles of border with Canada. They're bringing the pot across. It's coming down to Lawrence. They're splitting it in Lawrence. They're going down to New York. They're getting the fentanyl and the cocaine. It's being trafficked back up through New Hampshire. So, yeah, I want to see that stop.
Let's stay with international issues for a moment here. Do you think that the United States is losing any moral authority in trying to broker a deal between Ukraine and Russia that forces Ukrainians to give up land? It seems quite clear who the aggressor is here, Russia. They did the invasion. But there just seems to be this growing willingness in Washington to appease Putin, to let him get some of what he wants.
I think there's going to be a little bit of pain on both sides, but I certainly would like to see the killing and the war stop, especially in this day and age. So if Ukraine has to give up a little bit of territory in order to have the war end, I think they should be amenable to it.
Who's the bad guy in this situation, though?
I think Russia is definitely the aggressor, yes.
Trump administration was supposed to release the Epstein files completely by now. It is not. There's millions more documents to review. Obviously, some of that is important to be able to do. Why not release just the whole files? Do you think that should be done?
I absolutely think that should be done. I think the American people deserve transparency. And where those chips fall, they'll fall. And see what, what happens, what happens.
Is it frustrating to you at all that, some of these documents, it shows, like it's a phone memo back in the day when people would write down so-and-so called, and I think one of the memos said, so, quote, I have a female for him, but the only thing that's redacted is the caller's name. It seems like they're protecting people who have done bad things here.
I'm not aware of that, but I think it all should be brought out into light. So,
we have measles resurgent in the United States right now. Cases are growing. We haven't seen this many cases in the United States since 1992. Vaccination rates are falling below the point where we would have that so-called herd immunity that would keep it at bay, of the eradication status, I believe it's called. Should Congress do anything about this?
When I get elected to Congress, I will never vote for a vaccine mandate. It's up to the individual families to decide what they want to do with their bodies and their children's bodies. It's not up to the federal government to mandate that.
So even if we see a disease like measles coming back, the answer is not essentially.
I think it would be more education. Educate the families and tell them that this is a problem, and if they want to go down that path, they can have their kids immunized.
Okay. But I do want to touch on energy policy. The last time you were here, we talked a lot about nuclear power, and that's a big push for you, not just at the State House, but in the 1st Congressional District in this race. Natural gas pipeline. A lot of people rely on natural gas to heat their homes. Would you be supportive of additional natural gas infrastructure coming into the 1st District?
I would. We spent, the federal government spent $300 million with the city of New York to extend the pipeline. Now just have to get it through Massachusetts. But beyond that, there's a thing called the Jones Act that was done in the 1920s to protect shipping industry. So shipping lanes the gas can only be brought by an American company with an American crew. So we don't have any American ships anymore that are doing that. So I would like to see New Hampshire get an exemption from the Jones Act in order to bring that up instead of having to do it. Like right now, if they want to get gas out of New Jersey, it has to go someplace like Greenland and come back to the United States. It doesn't make any sense. So I'd like to see the exemption for that. And I do understand that 50% of the energy here in New Hampshire is natural gas.
All right, one last question on the race here in the 1st District. Right now, the front runner on the Democratic side is Stephanie Shaheen. If you're the nominee against her, how would you take her on?
I just take her on against her policies. I think a lot of policies don't make any sense, and I'm the only person that's actually qualified to do the job. I'm the only person that's already won 2 elections. I'm a current state representative, and I know how to do the legislation. So I think my issues are good issues, and I don't think just because her last name is Shaheen, she deserves to be in Congress.
All right, Representative Cole, thanks so much for joining us here on Close Up. We'll see you out there on the campaign trail.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, and we have plenty of candidates running in the 1st Congressional District, not so many in the race for governor, particularly when it comes to the Democrats. We'll try to find some answers on that front after the break.